Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with 1 like, 1 subscribe, and 1 share.
The words that defined my life for years. I'll never forget the moment he said it. We were sitting in a crowded restaurant, and I was young, too young to be told I was too old for anything. But he said it anyway, with the casual cruelty of someone who had no idea how deeply his words would cut. He said, "You're not getting any younger, you know. You should probably lower your expectations. Love isn't for people like you anymore." I laughed it off at the time. I pretended it didn't bother me. But those words burrowed into my brain like a parasite, growing and festering until I believed them with every fiber of my being. For years, I repeated them to myself like a mantra. Love isn't for me. I'm too old. I missed my chance. I stopped looking. I stopped hoping. I stopped believing that anyone would ever see me as anything other than someone past their prime. I built walls around my heart so high that I convinced myself I didn't need love anyway. I focused on my career, my friends, my hobbies, anything to fill the void that had been carved out by those cruel words. And for a long time, it worked. I was functional. I was successful. I was content. But I wasn't happy. Because happiness requires hope. And I had none left. I was in my late 30s when those words were spoken to me, and by the time I reached 45, I had fully accepted my fate. I was going to be alone. Not because I wasn't worthy of love, but because I had been convinced that I had aged out of it. That love was a young person's game, and I had already lost. I stopped dating. I stopped dressing up. I stopped even looking at men as anything other than colleagues, acquaintances, strangers. I was so convinced of my own undesirability that I made it a self-fulfilling prophecy. I would go to dinner parties and watch my friends' eyes light up when they talked about their partners, their dates, their new relationships. And I would feel that familiar ache in my chest, the one I had learned to ignore, the one I had convinced myself was just loneliness, not longing. But I was lying to myself. I did long. I did hope. I just didn't believe it was possible anymore. And then something happened that I never expected. Something that shattered every single belief I had built about love, age, and what I deserved. It started with a coffee shop. A stranger. A simple question. And a choice that would change everything. I had given up on love. I had accepted that I was too old, too late, too set in my ways. But the universe, it turns out, has a sense of humor. And it was about to prove me wrong in the most beautiful way imaginable. The years I gave up on love. Here's what happens when you believe you're too old for love. You start making decisions based on that belief. You stop dressing up. You stop going out. You stop looking at people really looking, because what's the point? I spent almost a decade in this fog. Every invitation to a party, every dinner with friends, every blind date my well-meaning friends tried to set up, I said no. It was easier that way. Easier to stay home with my books, my tea, my carefully constructed routine. Easier to tell myself I didn't need anyone. Easier to pretend that the ache in my chest was just loneliness, something I could manage with distraction and denial. I became so good at pretending that I almost believed it myself. Almost. But there were nights, late nights, when the house was quiet and my thoughts were loud, when I couldn't pretend anymore. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, and I would feel that familiar emptiness spreading through my chest like cold water. I would think about the life I could have had. The partner I could have loved. The family I could have built. I was in my early 40s, and I had given up on all of it because of a few cruel words spoken by a man who didn't deserve the power I had given him. I let him define me. I let him convince me that I wasn't worthy. I let him steal my hope. And I was so angry at myself for that. Angry that I had been so weak. Angry that I had let those words burrow so deep into my soul. But I didn't know how to fight back. I didn't know how to unbelieve something I had been telling myself for so many years. I didn't know how to open a door I had locked and bolted and covered with concrete. So I stayed in my comfortable cage. Safe. Alone. Miserable. And then one day, a friend dragged me out of my house and into a coffee shop. She told me I needed to get out more. She told me I was wasting my life. She told me I was still young enough to find love. And I laughed at her. I laughed because she didn't understand. She was married, settled, happily paired. She had no idea what it was like to be single at my age, to feel invisible in a world that only seemed to care about youth and beauty. But she made me go anyway. And that decision, the decision to leave my house that morning, changed everything. I walked into that coffee shop with zero expectations. I ordered my usual latte. I sat down in a corner booth and pulled out my book. And then a man walked in. He was older than me, maybe late 50s, with gray hair and kind eyes and a gentle smile. He caught my eye for a second, and I looked away, embarrassed. But he didn't look away. He walked over to my table and said, "Is this seat taken?" And my heart, which I thought had stopped beating years ago, started pounding so loudly that I could barely hear my own voice say, "No." I had no idea that this moment would be the beginning of something I had given up on years ago. Something I had been convinced I would never have. Something that would prove, once and for all, that love doesn't care about your age. The unexpected encounter at the coffee shop. I want to tell you about the moment my heart started beating again after almost a decade of silence. It happened in a coffee shop that smelled like burnt espresso and cinnamon, on a Tuesday morning when I had absolutely no expectations. The man with the gray hair and kind eyes didn't just ask if the seat was taken. He sat down before I could say yes, like he already knew the answer. And instead of being annoyed, I found myself smiling. He introduced himself as David. He was 57 years old, a retired architect, a widower who had lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier. He told me all of this within the first 10 minutes of our conversation, and I was so stunned by his openness that I forgot to be guarded. He said, "I'm too old to play games. I've learned that life is short and precious, and I don't want to waste a single minute pretending to be someone I'm not." I stared at him, completely disarmed. Here was a man who had experienced loss, grief, and heartbreak, and he was still sitting across from me, smiling, open, hopeful. He hadn't given up. He hadn't let his age define him. He hadn't let his past steal his future. And I realized, in that moment, that I had been hiding behind my fear for so long that I had forgotten what courage looked like. He asked me about my life, and I found myself telling him things I had never told anyone. I told him about the man who had told me I was too old for love. I told him about the years I had spent believing it. I told him about the walls I had built, the hope I had buried, the dreams I had abandoned. And when I finished, he reached across the table and took my hand. He said, "You're not too old. You're not too late. You've just been waiting for someone to remind you of what you already know." I felt tears streaming down my face. This stranger, this man I had just met, was seeing me more clearly than anyone had seen me in years. He wasn't trying to fix me. He wasn't trying to save me. He was just reminding me that I was still worthy. I pulled my hand away, suddenly terrified. This was too much. Too fast. Too vulnerable. I stood up to leave, and he said, "I'll be here tomorrow. Same time. If you want to talk again." I walked out of that coffee shop with my heart pounding and my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to feel. All I knew was that something had shifted inside me. Something that I had thought was dead had started to stir. And I was terrified. Because opening my heart again meant risking everything. It meant letting go of the safety I had built. It meant trusting that this time would be different. I wasn't sure if I was brave enough. I wasn't sure if I could do it. But the next morning, I found myself walking back to that coffee shop anyway. And what happened next would change everything I thought I knew about love, age, and second chances. My greatest fear. You know what's more terrifying than being alone? The possibility of being hurt again. That's what I thought about for the entire 24 hours between my coffee shop conversation with David and the next morning. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, and I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff. Looking down at an ocean I didn't know how to swim in. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to stay away. "You're too old for this," one voice whispered. "He's just being polite," another voice chimed in. "He'll realize you're not worth it," the loudest voice insisted. I had spent years building my walls, years convincing myself that I didn't need love, years protecting myself from the possibility of rejection. And now, a stranger had walked into my life and made me feel something I had buried so deep I thought it was gone forever. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was the scariest thing I had ever felt. Because feeling something again meant risking everything. It meant admitting that I had been wrong, that I wasn't too old for love, that I hadn't missed my chance. That the man who had spoken those cruel words to me so many years ago had been completely and utterly wrong. It meant letting go of my safety net and trusting that someone else wouldn't let me fall. I didn't know if I was strong enough to do that. I didn't know if I could survive another heartbreak. I had already been broken once. I wasn't sure I could survive being broken again. But there was another voice inside me, a quiet, persistent voice that I had been ignoring for years. It was the voice of the woman I used to be, before I let fear define me. It was the voice of the girl who believed in love, who believed in second chances, who believed that it was never too late to start over. And that voice was telling me to go. To take a chance. To trust that this time would be different. I fell asleep that night with my heart pounding and my mind racing. And when I woke up the next morning, I made a decision. I was going to go back to that coffee shop. I was going to see if David was there. I was going to give myself permission to feel something again, even if it scared me. But as I walked down the street toward the coffee shop, I felt my resolve starting to crumble. What if he wasn't there? What if he had changed his mind? What if I had imagined the whole connection? I was so consumed by my fear that I almost turned around. I almost ran back home and locked myself in my safe, comfortable cage. But then I saw him. He was sitting in the same booth, 2 cups of coffee on the table, waiting for me. And my heart, which I had been so sure was dead, started beating again. He looked up, smiled, and said, "I knew you'd come." And I realized, in that moment, that I had been given a second chance. A chance to prove that I was wrong. A chance to prove that love wasn't finished with me yet. But I had no idea what would happen next. And I was terrified to find out. What if I told you age is just a number? He didn't just say, "I knew you'd come." He said it like he had been waiting for me his whole life. Like he had always known that I would eventually walk through that door, that I would eventually find the courage to take a chance on love again. And in that moment, something inside me shifted. I sat down across from him, and I started talking. I told him about the years I had spent hiding, the walls I had built, the fear that had kept me trapped in my comfortable cage. I told him about the man who had told me I was too old for love. I told him about all the ways I had let that one cruel sentence define my entire existence. And he listened. Not the way people usually listen, with one ear, waiting for their turn to speak. He really listened. He nodded. He asked questions. He shared his own stories of loss and grief and finding hope again. And when I finished, he said something that made my heart skip a beat. He said, "I don't see your age when I look at you. I see a woman who has been through something hard and survived. I see someone who is still standing, still fighting, still hoping, even if she doesn't want to admit it. And that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." I felt tears streaming down my face. This man, this wonderful, kind, open man, was seeing me. Not my age. Not my past. Not my fear. Just me. He didn't care about the number of years I had lived. He cared about the person I had become. He was proving to me, in a way I couldn't ignore, that love doesn't have an expiration date. Love isn't reserved for the young, the beautiful, the flawless. Love is for anyone brave enough to open their heart, to risk being hurt, to believe that second chances exist. I took a deep breath and asked him the question I had been too scared to ask. I said, "Why me? Why would you want to be with someone like me?" And he leaned forward, looked me straight in the eyes, and said, "Because you're real. You're not pretending. You're not playing games. You've been through the fire and you're still standing. And that's exactly the kind of person I want in my life." I started crying, happy tears, the kind I hadn't cried in years, because for the first time in a decade, someone had made me feel worthy. Not despite my age, but because of everything I had become. He didn't see me as old. He saw me as experienced, resilient, beautiful. And in that moment, I realized that I had been so focused on the number that I had completely missed the person I had become. I was still worthy of love. I had always been worthy of love. I just needed someone to remind me. And that someone was sitting right in front of me. We talked for 3 hours that morning. We made plans to meet again. And for the first time in years, I felt hope. But the journey wasn't over yet. Because the biggest challenge was still ahead of me, facing the world that had made me feel invisible for so long and proving that I was still here. Still fighting, still worthy of everything I deserved. The first date I almost ran from. I'm about to tell you something embarrassing. I almost didn't show up for our first date. Not because I didn't want to see him, but because I was so terrified of being seen in public with someone that I forgot how to breathe. David had asked me to dinner, and I said yes without thinking. But the moment I hung up the phone, panic set in. What was I thinking? I was a woman in my mid-40s, and I was going on a date like a teenager. It felt ridiculous. It felt desperate. It felt like I was trying to reclaim something that was no longer mine. I spent the next 3 days trying to talk myself out of it. I told myself I was too busy. I told myself he was probably just being polite. I told myself I didn't need the complication, the vulnerability, the risk. But every time I tried to cancel, something stopped me. I kept hearing his voice saying, "You're not too old. You're not too late." And I kept thinking about the woman on the bench from my other story, the one who started over at 60. She had taught me that it was never too late to chase your dreams. And now, I was standing in front of a mirror, wondering if it was too late to chase love. I put on my favorite dress. I did my hair. I looked at myself in the mirror and tried to see what David saw, a woman who was still alive, still hopeful, still worthy. It wasn't easy. The voice in my head kept whispering, "You're too old for this. He'll realize his mistake. You'll end up embarrassed and alone." But I pushed that voice aside. I took a deep breath. And I walked out the door. David was waiting at the restaurant, looking as nervous as I felt. When he saw me, he smiled, a real smile, the kind that reaches your eyes, and said, "I was starting to think you changed your mind." I laughed, feeling the tension in my shoulders start to melt away. I almost did, I admitted. But I'm glad I didn't. We sat down and talked for hours. Not about our ages, or our pasts, or our fears, we got all of that out of the way. We talked about our dreams, our passions, the things that made us laugh. We talked about the books we loved, the places we wanted to go, the people we wanted to become. And somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I realized that I wasn't just on a date. I was falling. Slowly, gently, beautifully, I was falling for this man who saw me as I was and loved me anyway. I didn't tell him that night. I was too scared. But I felt it. Deep in my bones, I felt it. When the evening ended and he walked me to my car, he took my hand and said, "I'd like to see you again. If you're willing." I looked at him, this incredible man who had walked into my life and shattered every belief I had about love and age, and I said, "I'd like that." And I meant it. For the first time in years, I meant it with my whole heart. But the biggest challenge was still ahead. Because now I had to face the world, and all the judgments that came with it. Facing the world together. Do you know what's more terrifying than falling in love at 45? Telling the world about it. That's exactly what I had to do after David and I had been seeing each other for a few weeks. I had to face my friends, my family, my colleagues, everyone who had watched me give up on love years ago, and admit that I had been wrong. I was terrified. I could already hear the whispers. "She's too old for this. He's just a rebound. This won't last." I had spent so many years convinced that I was invisible, that no one would ever see me as worthy of love. That I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. And now that I was finally being seen, I was terrified that everyone else would judge me for it. My best friend Sarah was the first person I told. We were sitting in her kitchen, drinking tea, and I could barely get the words out. I said, "I've been seeing someone." Her eyes lit up. "What? Who? Tell me everything." I told her about David. I told her about the coffee shop, the conversation, the first date, the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the room. And I waited for her to say something about my age. I waited for her to tell me I was being foolish, that I was too old for this, that I should just give up. But instead, she reached across the table, took my hand, and said, "I'm so happy for you. I thought you'd given up. I'm so glad you didn't." I started crying, relieved tears, happy tears, the kind I hadn't cried in years. Because my best friend, the person who knew me better than anyone, didn't see my age. She just saw me. Happy. Hopeful. Alive. She told me that she had been worried about me for years, that she had watched me close myself off from the world. That she had been praying that something would wake me up. And now, something had. Someone had. I realized, in that moment, that I had been so afraid of judgment that I had forgotten to trust the people who loved me. I had been so convinced that everyone would reject me that I had rejected everyone first. But Sarah didn't reject me. She celebrated me. She was proud of me. And that gave me the courage to keep going. I told my other friends. I told my colleagues. I told my family. And every single time, I braced myself for the judgment that never came. Instead, I found support. Encouragement. Love. And I realized that I had been the only one judging myself all along. The world wasn't against me. My age wasn't against me. I had just been too scared to see the truth. But the biggest challenge was still ahead of me, the challenge of finally letting myself believe that I deserved this. That I deserved love. That I deserved happiness. That I deserved David. Learning to believe I deserved love. The hardest part of falling in love at 45 wasn't telling other people. It was convincing myself that I deserved it. Because even after David had told me he loved me, even after my friends had celebrated with me, even after everything had gone so beautifully right, there was still a voice inside me that kept whispering, "This can't be real. This won't last. You're not good enough." I had spent so many years believing that I was too old for love, that I had missed my chance, that I wasn't worthy of being loved. And those beliefs didn't disappear overnight just because someone had walked into my life and proven them wrong. I struggled with it. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing, convinced that David had changed his mind. I would overthink every text message, every phone call, every conversation, searching for signs that he was about to leave. I was so used to rejection that I didn't know how to accept love. I didn't know how to trust that someone could actually want me. David noticed. Of course he did. He was too perceptive not to. One evening, he took my hand and said, "What's going on in that head of yours?" I couldn't lie to him. I told him everything, about the voice inside me, the fear, the doubt, the feeling that I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I told him that I was terrified of waking up one day and finding out that this was all a mistake. He listened, the way he always did, and then he said something that I will never forget. He said, "I can't promise you that everything will be perfect. I can't promise you that we'll never fight or that we'll never hurt each other. But I can promise you this, I'm not going anywhere. I choose you. Every single day, I choose you. And nothing you say or do will ever change that." I started crying, of course I did. Because crying is apparently my permanent emotional state now, and I held on to him like he was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. And in that moment, I realized something that I should have realized years ago. I wasn't too old for love. I wasn't too broken for love. I wasn't too anything for love. I had just been too scared to let myself be loved. And I was finally ready to let that go. I was finally ready to believe that I deserved this. That I deserved him. That I deserved happiness. It wasn't an easy journey. It wasn't a quick fix. But I was learning, day by day, moment by moment, that love doesn't care about your age. It doesn't care about your past. It just cares about your willingness to open your heart and trust. And I was finally willing. But the most beautiful part of this story was still to come. The part that would prove, once and for all, that the man who told me I was too old for love was wrong. So completely, utterly, beautifully wrong. 1 year later, the life I never expected. I want to tell you what happened exactly 1 year after David walked into that coffee shop. We were sitting on a bench by the lake, watching the sunset. And I felt this overwhelming wave of gratitude wash over me, so powerful that I started crying right there in public. Not sad tears. Not overwhelmed tears. Just happy tears. Because I had spent so many years convinced that my life was over, that I had missed my chance at love, that I would never feel this way again. And here I was, at 46 years old, more in love than I had ever been. David turned to me, saw the tears streaming down my face, and said, "What's wrong?" I laughed through my tears and said, "Nothing's wrong." Everything's right. For the first time in my life, everything is right. He wrapped his arm around me and pulled me close, and I leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his body, the steady rhythm of his breathing. The safety of being held by someone who genuinely, wholeheartedly loved me. I thought about all the years I had wasted. All the years I had spent hiding, convincing myself that I didn't need love, that I was better off alone, that I was too old for this. And I realized, with a clarity that took my breath away, that I had been so wrong. Love doesn't care about your age. It doesn't care about your past. It doesn't care about the mistakes you've made or the years you've lost. It just cares about whether you're brave enough to open your heart and let it in. I had spent years running away from love, and David had spent years waiting for someone like me. Not someone younger. Not someone more beautiful. Just someone real. Someone willing to try again. We had built a life together, a simple life, but a beautiful one. We had our routines, our rituals, our inside jokes that no one else understood. We had learned to trust each other, to lean on each other, to love each other in a way that felt both new and ancient. And I realized, sitting on that bench by the lake, that this was the life I had always dreamed of but never believed I deserved. I looked at David and said, "Thank you." He looked confused. For what? For not giving up on me, I said. For seeing me when I was invisible. For loving me when I couldn't love myself. He kissed my forehead and said, "I would wait 1,000 years for you. And I would do it all over again." I cried some more, because that's apparently what I do now, and I held on to him like he was the most precious thing in the world. Because he was. The man who had told me I was too old for love was wrong. So completely, utterly, beautifully wrong. Love wasn't finished with me. It had just been waiting for me to be ready. And now, I was. But the most beautiful part of this story was still to come. The moment when I would finally let go of all my old beliefs and fully embrace the life I had been given. The love I found when I stopped looking. Do you want to know the most beautiful irony of this entire story? I spent years searching for love, desperately trying to find someone who would see me, who would choose me, who would prove that I wasn't too old. And the moment I stopped searching, the moment I gave up and accepted my fate, love found me. Sitting in a coffee shop, reading a book, completely unprepared for the man who would walk through the door and change everything. I thought about all the years I had wasted. All the years I had spent hiding, convincing myself that I didn't need love, that I was better off alone, that I was too old for this. And I realized, with a clarity that took my breath away, that I had been so wrong. Love doesn't care about your age. It doesn't care about your past. It doesn't care about the mistakes you've made or the years you've lost. It just cares about whether you're brave enough to open your heart and let it in. I thought about the man who had told me I was too old for love. I wondered if he ever thought about me, if he ever realized how deeply his words had cut. If he ever regretted the casual cruelty that had defined my life for so many years. And then I realized it didn't matter. Because I had proven him wrong. Not by finding love, but by finding myself. By learning to believe that I was worthy, regardless of my age. by opening my heart to David, not because I needed him to save me, but because I was finally ready to be saved. David and I have been together for 2 years now. We live together in a small house with a garden and too many plants. We have a routine that I used to think was boring, but now I realize is just peaceful. We wake up together, make coffee together, read the news together. We have our own separate lives, our own separate interests, our own separate friends. But we always come back to each other. Every single night. I used to think that love was for the young. I used to think that I had missed my chance, that I had aged out of romance, that I would spend the rest of my life alone. But I was wrong. So beautifully, completely, wonderfully wrong. Because love doesn't have an expiration date. It doesn't care about your wrinkles, your gray hair, your history. It just cares about whether you're willing to take a chance. And I finally did. I sat on the porch with David this morning, watching the sunrise, and I thought about everything I had been through to get here. All the pain. All the doubt. All the years I spent convinced that I wasn't worthy. And I realized, with a smile on my face and a warmth in my heart, that I wouldn't change a single moment of it. Because every tear, every sleepless night, every moment of despair, it all led me here. To this man. To this life. To this love that I never thought I deserved. I turned to David and said, I love you. He smiled, that familiar, comforting smile, and said, I love you too. And I always will. And I believed him. For the first time in my life, I fully, completely, utterly believed him. Because I had finally learned to believe in myself. And that, I realized, was the greatest love story of all. That's all for today. I'll make more similar videos in the future. Don't forget to subscribe to see them.